My guest today is Dr. David Bates, Emeritus Professor of Medieval History at the University of East Anglia, leading expert on the history of Britain and France from 10th to 13th century, and more importantly, author of numerous books dedicated to the Anglo-Norman history. Welcome to the show, Professor Bates.
Thank you very much for setting up this interview.
In the previous episode, we tried to revisit William's complicated upbringing and the anarchy that marked his minority. His coming of age, represented, I would say, by the Battle of Valais-Dunes, and generally speaking, the major events of William's rulership prior to 1066. In this episode, we will be talking less about Duke William and shall focus on his transition to King William, victor of Hastings and ruler of England for over 2 decades. So, in an attempt to pick up the story where I left off, I would like to begin by taking another look at the Normans as they were getting ready for the cross-channel attack in the summer of 1066. So in terms of manpower, Orderic Vitalis, and as well as a Pontevin Chronicle, were eventually to speak about 14,000 men. Poitiers went even further, 50 or maybe even 60,000, not to mention Carmen with 150,000. Which is simply ludicrous. Well, in your first book on William, you seem to favor the theory according to which the Duke's force counted some 7,000 men. What could have been actually the size of this Norman armada?
Well, this in the end, it is almost impossible to say, which of course is reflected in all of the wildly different statistics you've quoted. In other words, when I wrote the book, and this is in some respects an admission of fallibility, but it's also a matter of saying, well, we don't know, therefore we can't really pin this down. I did like, which was in some ways an orthodox figure of 8,000. But in general, I'd now go towards a slightly higher figure. I've actually forgotten exactly what I decided in the book, but because to me, the crucial thing in all of this is that so many people were ready to join with William, in which was a very risky enterprise. So the whole business requires a large fleet and therefore a large army. And also it must be seen as a vote of confidence in William. And I'll go back a little to your introduction to say I don't actually think his early years were anarchy at all. There was a very short period of disorder, and we can quote the Bible. Woe to the land whose king is a child. Minorities are always somewhat difficult, and William's was. He had a lot of friends and supporters, many of whom were still with him in 1066 and beyond.
Is it safe to say that William opted to play a long game in 1066? Because he gathered this impressive force at the mouth of the Div, and then when he finally set sail in July, instead of heading to England, he actually moved up the coast to Saint Valery. Was it just luck that Harald Hardrada happened to strike first in the north? Or on the contrary, this may have been William's plan all along?
I think it was we're probably right to think he was playing a waiting game. He would have known that invasions from elsewhere were very likely. I mean, it's, of course, one of our difficulties in studying the Middle Ages that there's a lot of evidence we don't have, and the evidence we would like to have, and in particular, communication over distance is one of these. But given, that, the oath which Harold had sworn to William in Normandy, he would have known Harold well. He would have been very familiar with the politics of the likely politics of the English succession. Therefore, I think he was probably waiting until a moment when he felt it was as safe as possible to cross. And once he had learnt that Harold had marched north to confront Harold Hardrada, he then would have seen this was certainly the opportunity to cross.
Correcting me if I'm wrong, but I think the Battle of Hastings happened to be in some respects a replay of the Battle of Valesdune. William had no choice but to take decisive action because he was forced to live off the land, and thus the Norman ruler had to opt for this sort of battle-seeking strategy. What can be said about the means through which he managed to achieve his goal?
Yes, well, the only way in which well, there are only two ways in which he could have achieved his goal. One is for Harold to admit defeat and not fight. The other was to force a battle, which is what he was doing, and which what he did. The way he set about this was to devastate the countryside around, well, Hastings, and above all the town of Battle, which was founded around the abbey. He destroyed the countryside, which of course was the heartland of Harold's own family's power, almost as well, very much as an act of provocation. And we can see this in we can see this in the values of estates recorded in Domesday Book for that region are still far lower in many cases than they were before 1066, and also a reduction of population and animals. I mean, this, in other words, is something which is a universal feature of war, however we choose to, whatever we choose to think, and of course it's still very much with us in the present day in the Ukraine. Civilians are, and non-combatants are often the victims of what is judged by a military leader to be a military necessity.
It was more like a foretaste of the harrying of the north of a few years later.
Somewhat different in that it's somewhat different in that what happened before the battle was part of a military campaign. The harrying of the north followed most of the serious campaigning. One could say that in military terms it was intended to prevent further campaigns, and also it was a consequence of a cross-channel crisis. William had also lost control over Maine. I mean, we're leaping forward to 1069, but we can do so for a moment because what is always has to be in our minds when we think about 1066 to 1087 is that William was responsible for Normandy and England and Maine. And having lost control over Maine, having had these very serious invasions from Denmark and from the Kingdom of the Scots in 1069 and English rebellions, this probably was the great crisis of his life. On the other hand, having won the battle, having effectively defeated his opponents in the north in 1069 and early 1070, what he then did, of course, was controversial with contemporaries and indeed remains so. Yeah. So we could talk more about that later if you
Sure,
want
of
to.
course.
Fine.
Yeah, well, there was, in my view at least, a connection in terms of how he treated the local population, and the fact that a lot of civilians ultimately lost their lives in 1066, as well as during the harrying of the north for Yorkshire. I think it was a disaster, really. Yeah. Anyway, so we get to Saturday, the 14th of October, 1066, early in the morning, probably around 9 a.m. William came upon Harold before his army was in order, says the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. What does that mean?
Well, what I assume it means is that well, William's forces, of course, had concentrated since landing at Pevensey and moved up into further up into Sussex. Harold was probably still assembling more forces, and he was probably assembling them too close to where William's army was. which gave William the opportunity to attack, while Harold probably would have wanted to wait and, of course, hope to win through major or massive, possibly even a massive numerical advantage. Yeah.
Well, the this sort of life or death struggle, and the battle known by some as the Battle of Sand Hill, was to last until late in the afternoon. Could you give us a description of the two armies and which were, in your opinion, the key moments of the battle? Because there are all sorts of discrepancies between sources. On one hand, we have William of Poitiers, then we have the Carmen. So, could you please just give us a brief overview of the situation on the battlefield that morning?
Yes. Well, on that morning, well, the first point, which is really a recommendation to anyone listening to this interview to visit Battle. Of course, the English army was assembled on a ridge, high, up above where William was assembling his army. So we have to think in terms of Harold occupying what was arguably a defensible position, a very good defensive position. And William, for William to win the battle, he had to disrupt the English position with a view to eventually defeating them. Um, I am inclined to believe the stories of feigned retreats, but what of course is important, and I should have mentioned first, is that the Normans did have cavalry, whereas the English didn't. It was an entirely infantry army, and this is very clear on the Bayeux Tapestry, and indeed in other sources. So William's purpose was really to try to disrupt the English, and in many ways, the key moment was when the English advanced down the hill, possibly believing that they were going to win, or possibly because discipline had failed. And the tapestry in recording the deaths of Gurth and Leothwin, Harold's brothers, is actually probably telling us that the leadership and the lines of communication of Harold's army had been disrupted. So we have a moment, a crucial moment, and it's a very long battle. It lasts for several hours. We have a crucial moment at which the Normans are able to go on to the attack against a disorganized force. And of course, this does lead in due course to Harold's death.
I'm glad you mentioned Harold's death, because there's quite a lot of I'd say controversy about the way in which he lost his life. The tapestry, for example, shows us how the king was felled by an arrow that hit him in the eye. A depiction which, if I recall correctly, was backed up by several chroniclers. While the tapestry is open to interpretation, because we don't know exactly which figure is actually Harold. And even if, let's say, we accept the fact that he's the one in the upright position grasping the shaft of the arrow, the arrow itself is a point of contention, since the tapestry was restored in the 19th century.
Indeed. Yeah.
Well, then, so if we leave the tapestry aside, we have the Carmen, another, let's say, contemporary source, which gives us a totally different account. William caught sight of Harold on top of the hill and set out with a few of his men to kill him, and then continues with the graphic description of the injuries inflicted on Harold. How do you think he died? Because I know you've spent so much time studying this, and I think it would be great to have
Mm.
your point of view on Harold's death.
Yes, yes. In the end, my point of view is ultimately again the one that we probably in the end don't know. Yeah, and never will know. I mean, you've described admirably the problems of interpreting the tapestry for various reasons. And the prelude to the battle illustrates this very well. Um, I'm confident that the designer of the tapestry knew the Carmen. Now, if one then thinks of the deathbed scene, the death scene, sorry, or the killing scene, Harold is both, whichever body it is, he's being hacked down, which is not dissimilar from what the Carmen says, and it's also not dissimilar from what William of Malmesbury suggests. So I rather like the idea, but this will go on and on and on, this particular debate, that Harold may well have been hit by an arrow. If he was hit by an arrow in the eye, it would have been immediately fatal. But perhaps he wasn't hit through the eye, but he was wounded, and then he was hacked down. I think the only certainty in all of this is that, from William's perspective, killing Harold was, alongside, of course, defeating his army, after that, proceeding to kill Harold was a necessary part of his objectives.
Yeah, I think that given the propaganda role played by the tapestry, it's very likely that Odo had every intention to play on the symbolism behind that scene with the if that was actually the depiction in the original scene with the arrow piercing Harold's eye, because this represented that God punished him for breaking his promise, his oath.
From William's point of view, yes, Harold had broken promises. Yeah, and that actually, I mean, this is in so many ways, this is politics as we've always known it, isn't it?
Yeah.
William has to put forward what he believes is the argument to justify himself, and others will do the same. So the tapestry is not just saying Harold deserved to die. It is presenting a narrative which can at times make us think, and this is often observed, that Harold was a nobleman who made mistakes, or at least was defeated, possibly because God willed it. Yeah.
Um, in uh, in your recent book dedicated to William, you argue that his superior generalship at both a tactical and strategic level enabled the Normans to win the Battle of Hastings. Could you please expound on that?
The way in which he was able to force Harold into battle, the way in which his troops then remained very disciplined in being able to conduct the feigned retreats or the pretended retreats, the way in which he went on to the attack when the English army was becoming disorganized, and also the way in which, I mean, this is in everything, the Carmen, in William of Poitiers, and in on the tapestry, the way in which you see him rallying the troops, which shows how personally involved he was. It's, well, in the end, given William's military record over his entire lifetime, it's impossible not to think that he was a very good general. He certainly was, but I think he did. I think it is true to say he out generaled Harold. On the other hand, Harold may have become overconfident because of having already won the battle against Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. Yeah.
Well, victory at Hastings did not automatically make William King of England. He had
No.
to force the Londoners into submission first. Uh, well, in order to achieve this, the Norman tactics, and once again, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think were very similar to those he employed in Maine a few years earlier. Um, Instead of a direct assault, he opted for this sort of terror campaign. How come the English chose not to rally behind Edgar Atheling at this point? Was it too late to do this?
Um, I I would probably think it was too late. Hastings and of course Stamford Bridge and the death of Tosti had destroyed the family which had which had effectively been ruling, well, not necessarily on behalf of Edward the Confessor, but very much alongside him. So leadership had disappeared. The Northern Earls, Edwin and Morcar, had already lost at Fulford Gate, and in any case were very young. Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was a somewhat dubious figure. So and Edgar, well, he was of course he was an adolescent, as William had been.
Yeah.
But I think there must have been debates within London about whether serious resistance was possible, because another battle would have had to have been fought, and they may well have decided that William had become just too formidable.
Right.
And therefore the submission took place at Great Berkhamsted.
Right. So eventually, William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066. It is well known that the ceremony took place in the Confessor's new church at Westminster Abbey, with both English and Normans in attendance. During the ceremony, William, and I think this is a very important point to make, at least in my opinion, he promised to treat the English justly. And then a bit later, the service involved asking those in attendance whether or not they would accept the rule of the new king, a question which obviously had to be put twice in English and then in French. Well, the answer was obviously in the affirmative, but the Norman guards, according to William of Poitiers, misinterpreted the reaction of the English-speaking people, and they responded by setting fire to the nearby houses. Do you consider that William kept his word to treat the English justly? That would be the first part of the question. And then, in what concerns this reaction from the guards, did they really feel that the king was in danger? Or this was just another way for William of Poitiers to justify more burning, pillaging, even within London itself?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, to answer the second question first, or try to answer the second question first, I've always thought that this was probably a panic reaction in a situation which was still very, very how shall we say, very somewhat precarious.
But why didn't they, rush
We have
into the church if they thought that William was in danger, and instead?
no. I think they were. Yes, I see your point. I think it is probably that they were worried that there was going to be a popular uprising,
Right.
and this was going to encourage it. But it can also very much be William of Poitiers saying that once more, William has to take steps to consolidate his rule. And well, yes, the other, did he treat the English justice well? In many ways, this is one of the two reasons why we're conducting this interview. The first one, of course, is to explain events, which we've already been doing. But conquest and empire, as we know so much from our own times, are controversial subjects. And it is very striking that and this struck me very forcefully as we read the book, as I wrote the book. It is very striking that William of Poitiers, in what he wrote, and remember he didn't finish, come on to that later if you want to, but William of Poitiers, in what he wrote, is justifying William as a just ruler. On the other hand, the D version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle which was written, we don't know who actually wrote it, but was written by someone very close to Ealdred, the Archbishop of York, who crowned William, is effectively saying that William broke his promises and did not treat the English justly. So you're constantly balancing, and it's so important for your listeners and those who you guide and those who you talk to in Normandy, to realise that this is a universe, or to grasp and think around this as a universal problem for humanity. With debates always going on about justice. I am inclined to wonder whether William could not have been more conciliatory in those early years. But at the same time, he in the end has only taken control of, well, effectively the southeast, Kent, Sussex, into Wessex, because Edith has submitted, and London, and as far as he was aware, nothing further north. It, even at the beginning, it was very, very important to guarantee security, having made so many promises. On the other hand, guaranteeing security meant dispossessing English.
Yeah, you somehow anticipated my next question, because I wanted to ask you, how did William actually manage to impose his rule in the first years? Was it enough to build castles? Was it enough to give land to some of his loyal companions? Because there were quite a few rebellions right after the coronation. Dover, Exeter, people who were by William's side initially, like Eustache de Boulogne, seemed, to support the rebels. So there are quite a few influential people, even in England, who were unhappy with the status quo after Hastings. Sure, one can argue that it was normal for Gertha, for example, Harold's mother, to be unhappy. She lost her sons, but there were others like the earls in the north, Edwin, Morcar, Edgar Atheling. So how did he manage really to impose his rule in the initial stage of his rule in the first few years prior to the harrying of the north?
Well, there are several stages to this. The first one, of course, is that he leaves for Normandy very soon after, in March
With a lot of money.
1067. Probably with a lot of money, but also with a lot of the English, the leading English in his company. And William of Poitiers does say that they were taken as hostages, or effectively taken as hostages. So and he then leaves his brother Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, and William Fitzosborne, who was undoubtedly a very close friend on whom William depended a lot. He leaves them to start to take over the kingdom which was under his control. That is the region I've already described. And well, again, we have different verdicts on these months. Some say the castles were built and they tyrannised the local population. Others say castles had to be built to guarantee security. I don't know. I sometimes think that he would have done better not to have gone back to Normandy so quickly. And on the other hand, you can understand the psychology of someone who wants to show himself as having triumphed, to show that he is now a king. It is very necessary to do that. We're looking at. Conquest was certainly not complete in the sense of many people did not accept it. But again, this is the kind of trauma and disturbance which is normal in such circumstances. You have a second stage, and this seems to be decisive for reasons which I think are connected in the end with almost an explosion of all this discontent. You have a second stage, which is the crowning of Matilda at Whitsun 1068, which is a very grand ceremony, and of course is very, very important. But immediately after that, the rebellions break out, again in a very uncoordinated way. I don't know. To me, the psychology of that occasion at the crowning of Matilda, the associated psychology is one of victory now seeming much more certain, and those who didn't want to accept it, deciding they've got to do something. There is also the possibility, and it became much more important, of intervention from Denmark, by the king of the Danes, Sven Estridsson, you know, which again was a major factor.
Well, you just mentioned Matilda, William's wife. She was crowned queen at Whitsun in 1068. How important a role did she play during the last, might say, 15 years of her life? Because she died in 1083. Is it a false impression, or was she far more prominent a figure as regent in Normandy than she was as queen consort and sometimes later on regent in England?
I think Matilda is actually very important. What is, and yes, it is clear that she was left behind in Normandy, well, in 1066 and immediately afterwards, and on later occasions. Though it is worth pointing out that she was actually pregnant. I mean, this is, in human terms, this is astonishing. She was pregnant with Adela. Yeah, yeah, in 1066. Now, and Henry comes later, but at the same time, I don't think we can just say she's more important in Normandy. I think we should say that she is actually very prominent everywhere, fulfilling the role which she and William had agreed she would fulfill. I did actually use the word, describe her as a partnership. And what is also striking is that on every major occasion when she might have been expected to be in England, she was. Yeah, I mean, in other words, she would cross the channel when it became strategically and politically necessary in the eyes of her, William, and those around them.
Well,
And I did. It's one of those things. I think it feels like a discovery when I made it. She was actually acting on William's behalf in England in the early 1080s, at a time when everything again seemed to be falling apart in Maine. So yeah, I wouldn't say Matilda Normandy, William England. I sort of think in terms of a cross-channel partnership.
yeah, I was asking because I know that quite an important role was played shortly after her coronation. I think from 1070 by Lanfranc, by Odo. So, well, once again, I might be wrong. It was my impression that you hear so much about them and a little bit less about Matilda, but maybe it's just
Yeah, I think it is. In many ways, it's probably the bias of the sources. I mean I mean Odo is much more. Both Odo is much more often in England than Matilda. Indeed, again, quite how he worked as Bishop of Bayeux and
Earl of Kent.
uh, Earl of Kent and elsewhere in England. I mean, to call him Earl of Kent is actually, in many ways, misleading. He was Earl of Kent, but he was everywhere else as well, or in quite a lot of other places as well. And Lanfranc, of course, well, as Archbishop of Canterbury, he has to stay in England. So I think it may be, to an extent, a bit of a bias of the sources. But what I'd finally say, and this is something I've been looking at since I read the book, or since I wrote the book, there are only three people who act, who Domesday Book and Charters show act on William's behalf without his earlier approval. And those three people are William Fitzosborne, Odo, and Matilda.
Right.
And that's in England.
Sure. This was followed. Matilda's coronation was followed by that period comprised between 1069, 1070, 10 to 1073. I think quite a few authors describe this as the major crisis of William's rule, with the rebellions that continued. And in addition, I think you mentioned earlier the Danes and Sweyn Estridsson, who invaded in 1069. Well, William was, let's say, very agile, and he was capable to confine them in the estuary of the Humber. And the Danes ultimately chose William's money offer over a potential confrontation. With the Danes gone, the king, and now we get to that part in the herring of the north in Yorkshire. Um, to me personally, it's let's say, in a certain way, sure, at a different scale, reminiscent of William's attitude in the wake of the siege of Alençon some 20 years earlier. But do you think he was generally ruthless when he happened to run out of patience in situations like this? Or was William the tyrant that Orderic Vitalis and even the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle so often try to depict?
Yes, I'm not sure Orderic actually calls him a tyrant. No, he doesn't.
It's more like, a war criminal for what he did in Yorkshire. He blamed him for, the death of, I don't know, almost 100,000 people or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, inhumane. Yes, no. I mean, what is I've been thinking a bit about this again. What is striking, and I'm glad you brought in the treatment of the citizens of Alençon alongside it. It's almost as if honour is at stake. There are situations in which he can mistreat his own subjects, and indeed responsible for mutilating and effectively in the north killing them. Now, killing them, or at least depriving them of livelihoods over a very long period, because once you take away the population, once you destroy crops, and also once you destroy animals, particularly oxen, you are creating a humanitarian crisis which is going to last for a long time. Yeah. However, and yes, but if we start to look across the history of, well, let's say the period from the 8th century to the 12th, which is very much the period I know about, there are many examples of others who also destroy the livelihoods of their own subjects as a punishment for disloyalty or infidelity. Quite a few examples from Charlemagne's reign, for example. Then you have from England before 1066, Edgar, who is called the Peaceable. He devastated the Isle of Thanet because they'd mistreated merchants from York. Half-Canute ravaged Worcester, and so on and so on. And you can go on to events like Frederick Barbarossa's destruction of Milan. So you're effectively looking at an aspect of rulership into which William's behaviour fits, and which is, well, as you say, it is both shocking and actually terrible. But with you using the word war crime, I wonder whether contemporaries would have used its equivalent.
Yeah.
I mean, Orderic certainly says God would never have forgiven this. And indeed, William's behaviour later on his reign is that of a man who knows that he did something terrible. So what I'm trying to convey is that William is ruthless, certainly. He is a man with a strong sense of entitlement, and when he wants something, he sets out to get it in a way which is sometimes frightening, but is also remarkable. On the other hand, he is far from unique in the context of his own times. And of course, we have, because of Domesday Book, and of course, it's one of the great ironies that William commissioned Domesday Book, because of Domesday Book, we are able to understand much better the humanitarian consequences of the harrying of the North than we are for any of the other episodes that I've mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. I was wondering if this was truly the most let's say serious crisis that William was faced with during his rule, because metaphorically speaking, if I'm allowed to, to use a metaphor, I would say that in early 70s, he looked like, the captain of a sinking ship, with the Duke playing the role of the person trying to plug the holes, because you have the rebellions in England. He loses, he loses Flanders, and in Flanders in 1071, he also loses Williams Fitzosborne that you mentioned earlier. Then he has to march to Scotland, the peace agreement that he finally managed to have with King Malcolm, and then he comes to to France, because he has to practically conduct this reconquest of Maine. So, do you agree that this was probably the most difficult period during his rule?
Yes, I do. It really was a crisis because I mean, and we need always we should never think in terms of national histories, or at least we shouldn't think exclusively in terms of national histories during this period. William, because of his the victory at Hastings, the Battle of Hastings, has taken on effectively, well, cross-channel responsibilities, which are actually responsibilities which go beyond England, Normandy, and even Maine. And as you've rightly said, at that time, almost everywhere seemed to be in turmoil and against him. So yes, agreed, it is a the great crisis of his, well, probably of his political life.
Well, you in your book on William, you mentioned at one point that in the last approximately 14 years of his life, William spent somewhere around 25% of the time in England. So we were talking about these individuals that he trusted to act in his behalf, Matilda, Odo, and you also mentioned Lanfranc, the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1070, if I recall correctly. Who was this clergyman? For people who aren't necessarily familiar with important figure, who was he, and what made him such an essential member of the king's inner circle?
Yes, well, Lanfranc is indeed very important. Um, he, uh, he came from Italy, originally from northern Italy, and seems in his youth, probably, or this is what we're told, um, went through some kind of spiritual crisis and became a monk. Well, he originally probably came to Avranches or Mont Saint Michel, then became a monk at Bec or the Bec, and then became, well, prior at Lebec and then abbot of William's monastic foundation, Saint Etienne of Caen. Um, and then Archbishop of Canterbury. There was an attempt to make him Archbishop of Rouen, which William managed to stop, and Lanfranc himself stopped. Um, yeah, I mean, he comes over as someone who has, because of his international reputation as a scholar, and there's a bit of debate about the nature of that, but we can leave that to one side. but it comes over as someone who is known to the papacy, who is trusted by seemingly many people, and you know, must have been a very skillful political operator. It's very, so much of the surviving correspondence is, of course, connected with religious subjects, but it's noticeable that when Lanfranc is dealing on William's behalf with the revolt in England of William FitzOsborne's son and two other, well, Waltheof of the last surviving English earl, and one other earl, the Breton. It's notable that Lanfranc's initial purpose is to try to negotiate. Initial way of dealing with the situation is to try to negotiate. So I think we're dealing with someone who was probably subtle and intelligent, who knew how to work with William, and who again supplied, as did these other figures, qualities which supported the regime. It strikes me, and it strikes me as you write the book, that there is this very small group: Lanfranc, Odo until 1082, William FitzOsborne, Matilda, Roger de Beaumont, who is very interesting for lots of other reasons, Roger de Montgomery, this very small group who were with William throughout his lifetime, or with the exception of William FitzOsborne, of course. It's almost as if there's a political group who have qualities which are able to make the regime work. So I hope that in some ways portrays Lanfranc. I mean, there were other churchmen who were also very important. The Archbishop of York, Thomas of Bayeux, must have been, because William. I mean, you cite the statistic of only 25%, and I think that figure's a bit too high. 25% of time spent in England. But actually, this means that William is very dependent upon others. And it is notable of just how loyal, supportive, and proactive these other people are.
Talking about a clergyman, and inevitably we can turn our eyes to the church. In Normandy, William opted to have this sort of conservative approach when it came to the church. Were there any major changes in his relation to the church after 1066 that you observed?
Well, I think to me, there are signs of some changes in his attitudes before 1066. There is the appointment of Maurilius as Archbishop of Rouen in 1055. Maurilius was, of course, a monk, and not a member of the ducal family, as several of the bishops were, or indeed of other aristocratic families. Ditto Lanfranc, of course, came from a monastic background. The first bishop appointed in England, Remigius, Bishop of Lincoln, was also from a monastic background. So we're looking, I think, at a man who did value qualities which we could call religious, which we must call religious, who at the same time valued secular leadership. And in the case of all of these, and Odo obviously, and Geoffrey of Coutances also come to mind, you are looking at people who actually are able to fulfill religious roles and also political ones. And it does actually suggest on William's part what I was looking for here, the words I'm trying to find. It does actually suggest a capacity to an awareness both of his role as a religious ruler, which is enshrined by his coronation oath, and also a man who has to exercise power and sometimes very often power by force. So yeah,
Well,
it to me is it is in the end you know the problem of understanding William, and grappled with this many times as a biographer. The problem of understanding just how someone can be so demonstrably religious. And remember the story of his prostration before Archbishop Ealdred and before before Cluny, Abbot of Cluny, who can be demonstrably religious and also extremely violent. And it's a commentary on the man, but also on his times.
well, you made reference to Odo, William's half brother, several times, and yeah, I think he's the subject of one of your books that will be out soon, isn't he?
Uh, well, he's the subject of a book I'm hoping to write. Yes, I'm in the process of writing, and he was the subject of my PhD
Uh,
thesis.
could
50
you
years ago.
please give us a
Uh,
brief overview on Otto's life and personality? Because I would say to the vast majority of the people, he seems to be a little bit more obscure than other personages that we talked about today.
yeah, well, yes, he is strangely obscure because, um, well, no one wrote a life of him. I mean, William of Poitiers didn't he didn't have the equivalent of William of Poitiers. Um, no one, so and the Bayeux Tapestry and his involvement with that in many ways complicates the issue as much as it clarifies it. Um, what I think he has. What I would emphasise is that a lot of writers, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Aldrich, Jocelyn of Saint-Bertin, who is a hagiographer, all describe Odo as being secundus a rege, second to the king, conveying the impression of almost a deputy or a regent at times. But when you actually think of this in formal terms, there isn't much evidence for that, although it does surface from time to time in judicial decisions which he took. So I'm suspecting that we're dealing with, and going back for a moment to the the mutilation of the citizens of Alençon. This is William's loyal. This is William. He's punishing them because of the insult to his mother. And I almost think that, let's say, family mattered for William in a very important way, and it also must have mattered for Odo. And they go along seemingly contentedly, although because we don't have any record of any conversations. They seem to go along in collaborating until Odo got involved in this scheme to buy the papacy for himself. What is also remarkable, and you as a living in Bayeux will know, I mean, Odo is responsible for so many things in Bayeux. He didn't start the new cathedral. That was done by his predecessor, Bishop Hugh, who we often underestimate. But great expansion of the cathedral chapter, um, new cathedral dedicated in 1077, building of an episcopal palace, formation of a school, foundation of the monastery of Saint Vigor of Bayeux, um, interaction in Kent with the St Augustine's Canterbury and also with Lanfranc, around the Bayeux Tapestry and other things. The sheer energy and range of interests and connections of the man. He feels to me, like an international figure, who, without us quite being able to pin down the personal qualities which created this, which were central to this. Yeah.
Well,
I need to think some more.
you mentioned
Yeah,
William's family, and probably you can also talk about his relation with his sons, and I would say his relation with Robert, his eldest in particular, because it was quite turbulent.
yes.
You wrote, and I quote, William learned that the Achilles heel of many powerful men is their own family. Is it a bit ironic
Yeah.
that after having taken on such powerful men like I don't know, Henry the First, Philip the First, both the kings of France, King Harold of England, to name just three, um, isn't it a bit ironic that William's death was somehow brought about by the machinations of his own son?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's it feels like the first quarrel with Robert does very much feel like a family quarrel and also an intergenerational quarrel, really, isn't it? Because the names of, I mean, we rely on Aldrich a lot, but the names that Robert's supporters are very much the new generation emerging in Normandy. Um, yeah, and the settlement which follows is one that you know instates Robert in gives him responsibilities in England of a kind that he did not have beforehand. And which he exercises for quite a short period. Um, The second quarrel is much shorter in its length than is previously thought, although what is striking, of course, is that Robert is not present at William's deathbed and makes no attempt to be there. Um, I'm tempted to think in terms of a clash of personalities, but also again of something which was very, very frequent in the history of, well, all times really, isn't it? But certainly the Middle Ages, a son, quarrelling with the father. And of course, this did again disrupt the regime, and Robert also, and this was probably what was unforgivable, sought allies. Well, the French king, the Count of Anjou, he was stirring up yet again the instability around Normandy's frontiers, which is a constant theme in William's life.
It's remarkable that eventually he kept his promise and left Robert Normandy.
Yes, it is. It is remarkable, although I think, well, it'd be hard not to think of those around him falling about laughing because his, you know, the conquest of England was based on a promise which he believed and said had been made by Edward the Confessor, and therefore, well, if his whole life, or at least the great achievement of his life, had been based on a promise of that kind, he had to keep the promise to Robert as well. In other words, there's an undeniable logic in all of this. But it's also, I think, likely, and this fits with William Rufus, a lot of William Rufus's behaviour. It's also likely that William was closer to, well, his third son, the second son, Richard, died. William was closer to his third son, and something which I only put in. Sorry, talking about family, which I only came in quite late in the book, is that one of the first things that William the Second, William Rufus, did after his coronation, accompanied by Odo of all people, with whom he was soon to be at war, of course. But one of the first things they did was to go to York for the foundation of the monastery of St Mary's York, the Abbey of St Mary's York. It's almost as if Rufus's first act after coronation is to go to the, almost as an act of atonement, to the place where he knew his father had done terrible things. So we've got to think in terms of, well, the human relationships here.
The final months of William's rule in England were we might say, marked by this decision he made in 1085 to order a remarkable survey that we know today as Domesday Book. Um, what was its purpose? Was it just an administrative and financial instrument, or was it actually more than that?
I think it was more than that. Um, in the end, and I always go back to well, the words of Jim Holt, Sir James Holt, in 1086. Who effectively says we don't need to think too much about what it was intended to do. It was. And there are two things strike me, two main things I want to mention here. First of all, of course, there were precedents. You go back into the Carolingian period and you have Carolingian politique and so on and so forth. None of them are necessarily, there aren't textual parallels, but a survey of landholdings is not without precedent. So there are precedents. And William was aware, and I hope this is coming over very clearly, he was very aware of the responsibilities of a ruler, whatever you make of him as a man. I think that it has many purposes, really, and this again is something that others have developed more since. It has many purposes because it effectively consolidates people around the new regime. It does, if we think in terms of the human aspects of the making of Domesday Book, the way in which French and English would come together in shire courts, representatives of the hundred would come together on oath and give evidence, in which some disputes would appear, in which some disputes didn't appear but were then resolved later. Yeah, it's almost, I could, in some times, think of it not as a great imposition of power, but as a gesture of reconciliation or attempted reconciliation. Yet at the same time, of course, it anchors the new regime in a legal framework going back to the holding of land on the day on which Edward the Confessor was alive and dead, tempore regis Eduardi. Yeah. So yes, it is multifaceted, and in so many ways, I think it takes us. But also, of course, it means that forever, really, after that, or at least the Royal Treasury, evolving into the Exchequer, has the knowledge of not only who holds what where, but how much it is worth. And if you want to calculate taxes, reliefs, and wardships, all these taxes which are exercised when a great baron died, or when lands were in the hold of a minor or a woman, all of the sums could be made. They could add up the value and have some good idea of how much they should be charging. So it is a multifaceted operation, best understood as well, I think, not just by thinking great act of power, a terrible thing to do, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the E-version says, but at the same time, if we think of it from the bottom up, it's bringing people together in ways which must often have been difficult, but by others may well have been welcomed. And as it finally goes on to say, the Chronicle, when it was done, he left England for Normandy, taking with him, as was his custom, as much money as he possibly could. I mean, so in other words, the exploitative regime in England is also present.
Well, he traveled to the continent and eventually got involved in the siege of Mantes. Vexin proved to be, might say, a poisoned chalice offered to William's father by his overlord.
We must always think of William as leading a cross-channel life. And in fact, when you look at his religious patronage, and that of Matilda as well, it's Western European in scope. And he was invited to intervene militarily in the Iberian Peninsula, in Germany, in Italy, and so on and so forth. Yeah, a truly astonishing figure, yet one that still must retain the capacity to shock and sometimes indeed make us sad and angry. Okay.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that following the an injury, which is quite strange, really, he had fallen off the horse. Following that injury on Thursday, the 9th of September, 1087, William expired. I think shortly after dawn. To me personally, what happened next resembled a tragicomedy because his body was abandoned for several hours. Then it was sent to Caen to be interred in the Abbey Church of St. Stephen's in accordance with William's wishes. While during the procession, we have another fire starting in town, which meant that the monks alone had to carry the dead king to his final resting
Mhm.
place. And then, on top of everything else, when the corpse was finally lowered into the tomb, it bursts open because the space was too small. So, leaving all
Yeah.
these anecdotic scenes aside, what did William's death mean to people in Normandy, in England, in his empire, if I am to use the term you have coined?
Well, yeah. Yes. Well, I think. Well, I quite like. Well, I do like the idea of tragic comedy. It's of a tragic comedy. It is the removal of a figure who had dominated so many people's lives. It's hard to think of this psychologically, but it's someone seem who seems to be at the centre of everything, and I mean, it's William of Malmesbury who writes about his ability to dominate his court with loud oaths and telling everyone what to do and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's the removal of a dominant figure and no one really knowing what to do, or at least having to work out what to do next. So it's both a tragic comedy and it's also a commentary on a life which should always fascinate us, um, for reasons which are, I think, not just relevant to the 11th century, but are relevant to the history of humanity, which is why I'm so pleased that the likes of yourself are still, are pushing forward with informing, you know, um, everyone about this important historical time.
Yeah, well, it
And
was
I
actually
suppose
my last question because I wanted to know exactly what do you think was William's legacy, really, at that point.
well, what is his legacy? Well, his legacy, oh dear, yes. Well, I've actually written something about this so recently, but his legacy was, well, one can think immediately in, that his legacy was creating a cross-channel empire which lasted until 1204, which was profoundly influential in the making of the English kingdom and the French state, and it did the United Kingdom and so on and so forth. I mean, I I mean, one can only speculate that what might have happened if his victory in 1066 hadn't taken place. Would the French kings have decided to try to take over everywhere? Question mark. Um, Likewise, would the British Isles have evolved as they did? I mean, so it is a huge legacy. But I also feel that to re-emphasise the point that I I keep making about the universality of the significance of his life, received yesterday a the Ukraine via an email attachment, of course, the Ukrainian tapestry. Someone has drawn a tapestry of the invasion of Ukraine in the after the manner of the Bayeux tapestry. Yeah, so actually, his legacy lives on because of the images it's created. And I suppose I'd also say that, having given quite a few lectures after writing the book, um, his quite popular in Caen. Go to York, and he's not.
For
I
obvious
mean, I'm
reasons.
generalising. I'm generalising wildly, but he still evokes passion and interest.